Please tell us about your recent conversation with the French president. What did Macron want? Because there are various rumors circulating, including one that he rang to warn you against going to war.
Why would I go to war? Macron says. Well, you've just held a nuclear drill with Vladimir Vladimirovich. You're practically starting a nuclear war here. Do you want to use nuclear weapons? I said, God be with you. I personally said this in only one instance, if an act of aggression is committed against Belarus. That's all. We concluded by discussing Ukraine and the consequences if we, together with the Russians, were to attack Ukraine from the north.
Putin's closest ally has issued a blunt warning amid rising tensions involving Russia and NATO's neighboring state. Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko warned that the Ukraine conflict could take on a different character if further escalation occurs. With Russian missiles deployed in Belarus, Minsk has now sent a bold message to both Kyiv and NATO as regional tensions continue to simmer. Putin's closest ally, Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, has issued a bold warning over the ongoing Ukraine conflict. Lukashenko said that any military attack on Belarusian territory could fundamentally change the nature of the war. He warned that such a strike would cause the Ukraine conflict to take a completely different turn with potentially far-reaching consequences.
Please tell us about your recent conversation with the French president. What did Macron want? Because there are various rumors circulating, including one that he rang to warn you against going to war.
No, that was the point. But for someone to actually confront me about it. Listen, Emmanuel Macron knows me well enough to realize it's best not to warn me. Before I do anything, I think it over 1,000 times, and I ask myself, what happens next? Unlike them. As for Emmanuel Macron, the French president, that was the subject of discussion, but in this vein, Alexander Grigorievich. I'm amazed at how he pronounces it. Alexander Grigorievich, there's information that you want to go to war. I say, God be with you. I even cut him off. But I'm not planning to go to war anywhere. Why would I go to war? Macron says. Well, you've just held a nuclear drill with Vladimir Vladimirovich. You're practically starting a nuclear war here. Do you want to use nuclear weapons? I said, God be with you. I personally said this in only one instance, if an act of aggression is committed against Belarus. That's all. We concluded by discussing Ukraine and the consequences if we, together with the Russians, were to attack Ukraine from the north. You do realize that we will be forced to respond. I say, you shouldn't respond. You should strive for peace. Macron says, but we are striving for it. I say, if you were striving for peace then, having been to a meeting in Yerevan, perhaps Moscow isn't really your thing. You would have come to Minsk, and Vladimir Vladimirovich and I would have met you there. Well, just joking. He says, I wouldn't rule out such a meeting. I say, so you need to ring Putin. Come over, sit down, have a proper man-to-man chat. Well, he started going on about the European Union, saying he needs to consult them. I say, hold on, you're a veteran. You've been in power for so many years. And who's over there? German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, a very young politician. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, he's a young one too. Who's going to do the talking? They're all young. In Italy, the Prime Minister is a woman. What do you want? To put these responsibilities on a woman? You're the big boss, so get moving. You are, so to speak, the key player and driving force behind this in Europe today. You've been to Armenia. So now it's time for you to come and see us in Moscow or Minsk to talk things over. We'll sort everything out in person. There were a whole package of related issues, including the United States negotiations with us. We touched on this issue rather delicately. Here we came to the unanimous conclusion that all matters concerning European security and Europe itself must be resolved in Europe. It's not Donald Trump who should be patting us on the head and pushing us toward peace. We must resolve these issues ourselves, because we live right here. By the way, Donald Trump has already said more than once that the war in Ukraine was a European issue. He's right, and we must move in that direction. We need to take action, not wait for someone to pick us up like, Unreasonable kittens, sit us down at a table somewhere and force us to solve these problems. So it was a friendly, pleasant, albeit long, conversation lasting an hour and 40 minutes.
The Belarusian leader did not elaborate on what specific response Minsk or Moscow might take if such an attack were to occur. Lukashenko also claimed that several European NATO member states are encouraging Kiev to adopt a more threatening posture toward Belarus. The remarks come amid continuing tensions along Belarus' southern border with Ukraine, where security concerns remain high. Belarus continues to be Russia's closest military ally and one of Moscow's most important strategic partners in the region. Minsk has also allowed Russian forces to use its territory for military operations during the course of the Ukraine war. Since the conflict began, Belarus has significantly expanded its military cooperation and defense coordination with Moscow. Lukashenko's remarks come after Belarus announced the deployment of Russia's Oreshnik missile system on its territory. The Oreshnik is Russia's newest medium-range ballistic missile system and is seen as a significant addition to Moscow's strategic arsenal. Ukrainian analyses have revealed the true destructive potential of Russia's Oreshnik missile, detailing how its design and payload could translate into unprecedented damage if deployed in combat. Tests and fragment studies suggest Oreshnik's conventional submunitions weigh about 50 kilograms each, a mass that helps explain both their kinetic energy on impact and the pattern of damage they leave behind. Those submunitions appear to be solid cast metal ingots rather than sophisticated guided kinetic penetrators, indicating a simpler, and in some ways more brutal, approach to maximizing impact through mass and velocity. Fragments recovered from strikes show that the warheads are made of cast iron rather than higher performance steel or tungsten alloys, a factor that affects how they deform and what kind of damage they ultimately inflict. Experts caution that, despite extremely high re-entry velocities, the overall damage from these cast metal submunitions is relatively modest compared with guided penetrators or modern-shaped charges. In one documented case, a single submunition pierced a roof and continued through 5 floors before finally stopping on the building's first floor, illustrating both impressive penetration and limited controlled destruction. Impact holes left by these devices measured roughly 0.5 meter by 0.5 meter in several buildings, evidence of concentrated kinetic strikes rather than wide-area blast effects. Another recovered submunition penetrated a roof and the first floor and continued down to basement level, underscoring how some of these masses can travel deep into structures before losing momentum. One impact created a crater approximately 2 meters wide and 60 centimeters deep, showing that while some strikes are locally destructive, they do not always produce the large-scale devastation associated with high-yield explosives. How widely the submunitions disperse depends heavily on the altitude at which the missile warheads release them, with release height shaping the spread pattern and ultimately the scale of area damage. Analysts estimate that a nuclear deployment of these submunitions would likely require release altitudes on the order of around 5 kilometers to achieve the intended coverage and sequencing. Raising the deployment altitude substantially increases the coverage area and therefore the overall destructive effectiveness, meaning higher release points can transform many small impacts into a much larger combined effect. Russia has deployed its nuclear-capable Iskander-K missile units as part of large-scale joint military drills with Belarus, underscoring how nuclear assets are now integrated into regular regional exercises. As part of these drills, Moscow has moved mobile nuclear launchers into forested areas, with footage from May 20th showing the systems concealed in wooded terrain to practice survivability. The same video showed attack helicopters escorting a military convoy into a rural, wooded zone, highlighting how air assets will protect and support mobile missile units during a crisis. In the released footage, Russian troops can be seen preparing for cruise missile launches using the Iskander-K system, rehearsing the full sequence from deployment to simulated firing. Russia's defense ministry says personnel are training nuclear deployment procedures in highly aggressive scenario scripts, meant to mimic a fast escalating confrontation with a capable adversary. According to officials, the troops are specifically drilling to strike targets across Europe with the Iskander-K missiles, reflecting the system's role as a regional theater nuclear option. For these scenarios, Moscow is employing terrain-hugging cruise missiles, which fly low to evade radar and simulate realistic nuclear attack profiles against defended targets. In parallel, Russia's broader nuclear triad, its land-based missiles, strategic bombers, and submarines, has also entered full-scale exercises alongside Belarusian forces, integrating allies into its strategic posture. Many defense analysts say President Vladimir Putin is using these drills to send a pointed message to Western capitals about Russia's nuclear readiness, aiming to deter further military support for Ukraine and other moves seen as hostile. The Russian Defense Ministry officially announced the start of these three-day strategic nuclear exercises on May 19, framing them as a planned test of command, control, and combat readiness. The main objective, according to the ministry, is to practice how Russia would deploy its nuclear forces under conditions of an emerging or perceived threat. The exercises will involve around 64,000 military personnel and approximately 7,800 pieces of military equipment. This inventory includes more than 200 missile launchers, about 140 aircraft, 73 surface ships and 13 submarines. Reports say that among the submarines taking part are 8 Russian strategic nuclear submarines, which form part of the country's sea-based nuclear forces. The drills will feature launches of ballistic and cruise missiles from units based in Russia's Leningrad and central military districts. As part of the exercise, troops will also be instructed in how to operate Russian tactical nuclear weapons that have been deployed on the territory of Belarus. These strategic drills follow a statement one day earlier from Belarus Defense Ministry, which said it had launched its own nuclear-related exercises in coordination with Russia. According to Belarus Defense Ministry, missile forces and aircraft units are participating in the drills, which focus on nuclear deployment operations. The ministry said troops will practice the preparation and delivery of nuclear munitions as part of the training program. Officials added that the exercises will test combat readiness from unprepared and unplanned locations, stressing flexibility in launch and deployment options. Military units will also train in concealment and long-distance movement, underscoring efforts to make nuclear-related forces harder to detect and target. Belarus has insisted that the drills are not directed against third countries and claims they pose no threat to regional security.